Hi, my name is Oquin. The big picture that I took away from what we learned this quarter concerns mental health. My question is, how did the views about mental health evolve throughout Canadian history? This question kept coming up as we were taught about the many events that Canadians faced during the 20th century. I feel like the well-beings of Canadians during that time are not discussed enough, and I wanted to discover more about that. Just to clarify, I'll be discussing the mental health of citizens who struggled with their mental health in less severe ways than those in mental asylums. Mental health is defined as one's cognitive, which refers to awareness, behavioral, and emotional well-being, and it's a well-known topic to us now in the 21st century. The most common mental issues of 2021 are depression, substance abuse, bipolar disorder, PTSD, and more. There are many advocates that support and teach about mental health nowadays because we've realized its importance. But I've always wondered how people viewed it in the past and what they were doing to promote the importance of it, or whether they were doing anything at all. Cause and consequence. Firstly, the consequence of negative mental health in Canada can be drawn to the many events Canadians went through. For example, two events that scarred Canadians during the 20th century were World War I and World War II. World War I ran from 1914 to 1918 and was one of the bloodiest conflicts in Canadian history, killing more than 60,000 Canadians. It overall developed Canada's national identity and independence from the British Empire. The many casualties of this war supports the fact that soldiers and their families were deeply affected. Soldiers came back from the battlefield with shell shock, or as we know it today, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I believe this was the time neurologists and psychiatrists began to realize how this disorder could become a problem that could affect soldiers' lives and the people around them. World War II began with the rise of totalitarianism in Europe and ran from 1939 to 1945. Canada ended up declaring war and helping out the Allies even though they weren't threatened. By this time, Canadian soldiers had gone through much more than they did in the First War, engaging in much longer battles. Shell shock was then changed to combat fatigue, and psychologists began to perform screening tests when recruiting soldiers to ensure they didn't have psychological disorders that could affect them during battle. I think this was a great effort towards promoting awareness for soldiers' well-beings if they were worried it could affect their lives. Continuity and change. Back then, mental health was only concerned with mentally ill people who lived in asylums, and psychiatrists were not respected because of their involvement with them. Today, people depend on their psychiatrists to deal with problems happening in their lives. Events that display the continuity and change in history can support the way mental health has evolved in comparison to the present. Two subjects that show this are the Great Depression from the interwar decades and the Canadian government. The Great Depression started in 1929 and ended in 1939. It was said to be caused by the Wall Street stock market crash and by the widespread price drop in commodities, which led to declines in global trade and increasing unemployment. This was a difficult time for unemployed Canadians because, other than having no income, it gradually led them to become emotionally unstable when they lost their daily structure and self-purpose. This is similar to the COVID pandemic, but since technology has improved, people were able to communicate with each other and access help if they were feeling down. This displays how people are able to manage their stress now compared to back then when there was limited means of communication and little access to therapy. The Canadian government during the 20th century supported the Canadian Mental Health Association that was founded in 1918, but not as much as they do now. The CMHA promoted mental health and provided mental illness recovery programs to the public. It wasn't until after World War II when public interest in mental health was stimulated. Today, the Canadian government still invests in mental health organizations, but more generously. The government wasn't big on mental health back then because they were more worried about the struggle to maintain the economy, but in our 21st century, there haven't been any major conflicts or events in Canada other than COVID that could have made the government unable to support citizens mentally. Ethical dimensions. Considering the ethical dimensions of mental health in the past, there are many things we should learn from, but never repeat. Issues like women's roles during the post-war years and residential schools are two examples of this. During post-war Canada in the 1950s, suburban life and traditional families became popular, with the father being the breadwinner and the mother being the housekeeper. Magazines in the 50s shamed working mothers and promoted the idea of them being the cause of misbehaved children. Soon, however, many women felt trapped because they were basically forced into this role. Women in the 50s were literally brainwashed by magazines and advertisements that forced them to oppress themselves. It's no doubt that women's mental health was negatively affected by this, and that's why the understanding of mental health is so important, so that things like this don't happen again. Residential schools were another issue. They tried to rid Aboriginal children of their culture, and surprisingly, the last one didn't close until 1996. Children were taken from their homes and were physically and mentally abused, which clearly displayed their struggle. I'm glad we're able to learn about this so generations and beyond can understand that it's wrong and undeniably racist to force people out of their cultures. My little sister in 4th grade has learned about this issue, and although she doesn't know the horrific and gruesome parts of its history, she completely understands that what they did was wrong. This shows how much our mindsets have changed when it comes to the awareness of mental health and the tolls we place on people's lives when we do things like this. Historical significance. Mental health was a major issue in 20th century Canada, but not many people cared for it, let alone even knew the concept existed. The fact that people were often in distress was normal, and nobody actually thought that they could live better and happier lives. Discrimination and prejudice and youth mental health were significant issues in history that we learned from. English-speaking Canadians in the 20th century believed in white superiority and considered Asian and Black immigrants, as well as Indigenous peoples, lower in status. Efforts were made to exclude them from public services, schools, and many more. This represents how people back then probably ignored the fact that immigrants had feelings too, since they were considered lower and unimportant. So, English-speaking Canadians only prioritized the majority in ensuring mental hygiene, and minorities were more likely to struggle with their mental health. Now, as society is evolving, ethnic diversity is taught to be celebrated, and equality is now protected by the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I found that children and youth during the early 20th century is not often discussed. Especially during the World Wars, it was tough on them while they helped maintain farms and began working at young ages. Many kids were probably nervous for their relatives serving in the war and were traumatized when they passed. Not exactly comparing COVID to war times, but the youth of today went through a similar situation when COVID hit. Both events placed a negative toll on both kids, past and present. During quarantine, my teachers taught us how to take care of our mental health, which showed how the school systems made an effort to understand what kids were going through compared to little efforts made to support children before. Historical perspective. To collect an overall historical perspective of mental health, we should understand that Canada was just developing as an independent country at the turn of the 20th century. To display the lessons we have learned from the past, we have multiple mental health organizations in the present, and the study of mental illnesses has developed as time went on. The Canadian Mental Health Association, as mentioned, and the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health are only a couple of the many mental health organizations we now have. These institutions help promote the understanding of mental health to the public and advocate to protect individuals' rights and freedoms. This shows how much more we care about mental health nowadays than we did in the past. We've learned that people ignored the fact that they were depressed or traumatized, and society realized that we didn't want that to continue. So now, people can get the help they need with the programs offered by these institutions. The study of mental health has developed greatly throughout history. Dr. Clarence Hinks was a Methodist minister who organized the Canadian Mental Health Association with the help of other doctors. Dr. Hinks was one of the first physicians to recognize the importance of prevention and treatment of mental illnesses. During World War II, seemingly healthy people were examined, and it was found that they suffered mental illnesses, which affected overall attitudes towards mental health. Now, through our collective research, we can access treatments through family physicians, psychiatrists, social workers, and self-help groups, to name a few. This displays how people in the past worked together for the well-beings of others, and is a good lesson we should learn from history. Doctors and advocates for mental health in the 20th century cooperated to promote mental hygiene and eventually changed our society for the better. Evidence. To investigate more about how mental health evolved throughout Canadian history, evidence must be applied. One primary source that I found was a quote by Dr. Clarence Hinks. In his quote, he admits that doctors weren't doing much to prevent mental illnesses, even though they'd done a lot of research on it. This source of evidence displays how Dr. Hinks was determined to find ways to prevent mental illnesses and eventually led him to establish the Canadian Mental Health Association. This leads us to assume that Dr. Hinks contributed to one of the first steps in Canada's journey to improve mental health for its citizens. Another primary source that I found was a quote from the Canadian Psychiatric Association Journal, Volume 20, Number 5, published in 1975. The chapter is a historical note about Dr. Donald Campbell Myers, who established the Dr. Myers Neurological Hospital in 1898. The quote from the journal explains how Dr. Myers was the first to suggest preventive psychiatry, which complements the fact that Dr. Hinks was probably influenced by his work, since he later established the Canadian Mental Health Association that was centered around that idea. Overall, the concept of mental health became more and more acknowledged throughout history in Canada. By the end of the 20th century, many people understood what it was and were beginning to step up and talk about it. In our 21st century, countless organizations are helping to publicize mental health, and there are many programs that now offer help and treatment. My big picture idea displayed how the views about mental health in the past have gradually evolved for the good of Canadians' well-beings today, and these events in history exhibited just that.